I'll ruin everything you love today!
Your lies will destroy only yourself.
Marcia Pennington jabbed her finger at my chest like she had the whole neighborhood pinned under it. You're violating Section 14A, Elias. Those medical coolers are illegal storage. Her voice carried that smug edge she wore like perfume. Thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. I didn't even blink. You might want to be careful making claims about equipment I'm certified to install. I let the words hang there, just long enough for the board chair to lose a fraction of her arrogance. And before we go any further, where are you watching from? She scoffed, stepping back like she'd been insulted by physics, not by me. The enforcer in crimson flicked open her clipboard, pretending control she didn't have. The HOA never approved those devices, she said sharply. I kept my tone steady. The exemption is on file. Doctor signed, board approved, you were in the room. Her jaw twitched. The clipboard queen hated being reminded of anything that trapped her in facts instead of fantasies. I'm Elias Mercer, I said, quieter now, grounding myself. Licensed biomedical tech for 15 years. Every unit inside that cooler is FDA regulated, temperature monitored, and essential for my wife's treatment. You know that. The tyrant in heels folded her arms, eyes dragging over the sidewalk as if searching for a reason to call me a liar. She didn't find one, but she found spite instead. That's the thing about certain people. When truth threatens their power, they don't adjust. They attack. And she attacked in the worst place possible, my family's lifeline. I glanced back at the cooler sitting under our porch overhang. To anyone else, it was just equipment. To me and to Lena, it was survival. That device kept her medications viable. Without it, she'd be bedridden again, fighting fevers that took half her strength each month. She depended on it the way a heart depends on rhythm. You can't just place whatever you want outside, the officer of rules snapped, voice climbing. This neighborhood has standards. And that cooler is the only reason my wife can walk from the bedroom to the living room without collapsing, I answered. If you're looking for standards, start with compassion. But compassion wasn't in her training manual, revenge was. Have you ever felt that split-second surge of strength when a bully finally realizes you won't fold? Stick with me, and hit subscribe right now. This is about to get intense. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing with something sharper than authority, personal resentment. She'd fought this exemption tooth and nail, and losing had scarred her ego. I didn't realize it then, but every step she took from that moment forward was about reclaiming the power she thought my family had stolen from her. I'll be filing a secondary review with the board, she muttered, scribbling dramatically as if each pen stroke was a victory. Do what you need to, I said, but you know Lena's condition. You know what this cooler means. Her silence wasn't confusion. It was contempt. And that's what began everything. Because while that cooler represented life for us, Marcia Pennington saw it as a challenge, a reminder she'd lost once and wanted payback for. The resentment simmering behind her smirk was louder than her words. I didn't know she'd been watching our medical deliveries. I didn't know she'd been photographing our porch, our packages, the nurses' cars. I didn't know she was building a story in her head, one she'd soon accuse us of living. I just knew that when she walked away, the enforcer in crimson didn't look victorious. She looked hungry, hungry for a fight she thought she could win, hungry enough to cross a line no neighbor should ever cross. And by sundown, she would. Because before the night ended, Marcia Pennington would call the police and accuse my wife of being a drug dealer. And the K-9 unit she demanded for proof wouldn't just sniff out the truth. It would find it inside her own SUV. Marcia Pennington didn't walk away from my porch that afternoon. She stalked off like someone rehearsing her next move. I watched her heels snap across the sidewalk, each step a declaration that she wasn't done. And I knew, deep down, that her silence wasn't retreat. It was planning. By evening, word had already reached us that the board chair had been making rounds, stopping neighbors with that same faux concern expression she used when she wanted to disguise hostility as community care. The enforcer in crimson didn't even try to hide the fact that she was fishing for someone, anyone, to validate her anger toward us. Around 5, I stepped outside to bring in another medical cooler delivery. The sunset hit the white lid, casting a soft glow that always reminded me of why we fought so hard for Lena's treatment. As I bent down, I saw the clipboard queen at the corner, pretending to check a streetlight. She wasn't checking anything. She was watching us. "Evening," I called out. She didn't answer, just wrote something quickly on her pad, shoulders tight. That was the moment my stomach dropped. That wasn't HOA duty. That was surveillance. Inside, Lena sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with her infusion equipment ready. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. Stress made her symptoms surge, and I wasn't giving the tyrant in heels even that small victory, but I felt the pressure build behind my ribs. Something was shifting, something ugly. Later, while I prepared her evening dose, I caught a shadow through the window. The officer of rules stood near our yard again, phone in hand, filming our porch. She angled the camera downward, zooming in on the cooler, like she'd discovered contraband. I opened the door. "Is there a reason you're recording my house, Marcia?" She startled, just slightly, then forced that cold managerial smile she used when she wanted to appear legally untouchable. "HOA documentation," she said. "It's standard protocol when there are concerns. Concerns that were approved in writing. That's your interpretation, she scribbled again. Interpretation doesn't change signatures, I replied. Her smile faltered. We'll see. That phrase, we'll see, landed heavier than anything she'd said all week. It wasn't uncertainty. It was intent. When she finally walked away, I noticed something else. She wasn't heading home. She was heading toward the cul-de-sac, where she often met with a couple of neighbors who loved gossip more than gardening. I knew exactly how fast misinformation could spread, especially when it started with the clipboard queen, and spread it did. By the next morning, 2 neighbors avoided eye contact when I waved. A third crossed the street rather than pass my driveway. Another lingered at her mailbox too long, glancing nervously at Lena's medication shipment being unloaded from the nurse's car. Whispers, unease, suspicion, Marcia Pennington's favorite weapons. When I stepped out to speak with the nurse, I heard it clearly. I told you, something's going on. All those coolers. The enforcer in crimson had planted the seed, and it was already growing. That afternoon, Lena called me into the bedroom. Elias, she whispered, someone took pictures of our medical supplies. I saw a flash through the blinds. My pulse spiked. Who? I'm not sure. It looked like maybe Mrs. Greeley, but she ran off. I clenched my jaw. That wasn't curiosity, that was fear manipulated into action. The tyrant in heels was building something, and if neighbors had begun photographing medical equipment, she'd clearly convinced them there was something to document. The worst part? Lena blamed herself. Maybe this is too much, she murmured. Maybe the neighborhood hates us for the deliveries. No, I told her firmly. One person is stirring this up, and she's doing it intentionally. But neither of us knew how far Marcia Pennington would push it. We found out that evening. At 7:42 p.m., I stepped outside to close the cooler lid and saw flashing headlights rolling slowly down the street. A patrol car. My chest tightened. They weren't speeding. They weren't responding to an emergency. They were searching. And they were stopping. Right in front of our house. I didn't hear Marcia at first. I saw her. Standing beside her SUV, hair immaculate, clipboard pressed against her chest like a badge of authority she didn't legally have. And then she said it, her voice sharp and triumphant. There, that's the house. That's the drug operation I reported. The air felt heavier. The next morning, the street seemed narrower somehow, as if the gaze of the enforcer in crimson had already closed the space around our home. I stepped onto the porch, watching Marcia Pennington's SUV idling a few houses down. She tapped her clipboard relentlessly, scanning each window like a predator assessing territory. Inside, Lena's hand shook as she adjusted her medical cooler. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the strain of constant vigilance pressing on her shoulders. Elias, she whispered, voice tight, I can't keep doing this without knowing what's real and what's paranoia. I swallowed. I know, I said, but we need to see this through. Through the misty morning light, I noticed our neighbor, Simone Caldwell, lingering at the edge of the sidewalk. Simone had always been quiet, polite, and cautious, never meddling in HOA matters beyond the occasional community garden complaint. Yet now, her eyes darted nervously toward the Mercer's house, toward the medical equipment, toward Marcia's theatrics. Her fingers twisted a phone case repeatedly, an almost imperceptible tremor revealing her internal struggle. The clipboard queen had found her first unintended ally, or pawn. I could see the battle playing out inside Simone. Part of her wanted to comply, to appear dutiful. Part of her, the part that remembered neighbors helping neighbors, recoiled. Her gaze flicked toward our front yard and then back at Marcia, whose heels clicked on the sidewalk as she circled, confident and relentless. Marcia Pennington wasn't aware of Simone's hesitation. The board chair thrived on obedience and fear, rarely considering that someone might quietly resist her commands without immediate confrontation. The officer of rules, as she liked to think of herself, had grown so accustomed to authority that the idea of discretion or doubt was foreign. I decided to confront the subtle tension. Simone, I called softly, trying to pierce the unease without alarming the clipboard queen. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, cheeks flushing. I don't know what to do, she admitted in a low whisper, as if Marcia herself might be listening through the leaves of the maple tree shading the street. It's simple, I'd said calmly. You can choose to see things clearly, not through her lens, not through fear. The enforcer in crimson pivoted suddenly, her eyes locking onto Simone. Simone, she said sharply, voice carrying down the sidewalk. Don't get distracted. Observe, report, and act accordingly. We maintain order. Her heels tapped rhythmically on the asphalt. We cannot afford indecision here. Simone swallowed, her fingers tightening around her phone. I could see the moral struggle, the internal debate. Obey the tyrant in heels or protect the truth quietly. The clipboard queen may have thought she had everyone in line, but human hesitation is subtle. And in her overconfidence, Marcia Pennington failed to notice that hesitation had allies in plain sight. Meanwhile, I moved to Lena, placing a hand on her shoulder. Marcia Pennington thinks she's cornered us, I whispered, but her arrogance is already working against her. Every move she makes is visible to those with eyes to see. Simone's gaze flicked again between us and the SUV down the street. She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly shaking her head. The officer of rules didn't know it, but her careful surveillance had a blind spot, human conscience, and conscience can pivot in a single breath. By midday, the enforcer in crimson had moved to inspect a neighbor's hedge, ostensibly noting HOA violations, but in reality, performing a stage patrol. The clipboard queen scribbled notes, glancing at the Mercer property every few seconds, unaware that Simone had begun recording silently on her phone, her hands steady now, despite the tension. For the first time, I saw a crack in Marcia Pennington's plan. The board chair's influence wasn't absolute. Somewhere between fear and moral obligation, someone was questioning, observing, and documenting. And that someone, Simone, could change the entire trajectory of what the tyrant in heels had started. I retreated inside with Lena, keeping watch, knowing the battle was still invisible to the untrained eye but growing in momentum. The officer of rules may have believed her dominance unchallenged, but that fragile illusion was beginning to crumble. Simone's internal struggle had turned into action, a quiet rebellion that Marcia Pennington would not anticipate. And in that subtle shift, the scales of power began to tilt. By mid-afternoon, the street had transformed into a quiet battlefield. The sun cast long shadows across the Mercer driveway, exaggerating the tension that hung in the air. Marcia Pennington, ever the enforcer in crimson, strode back and forth, clipboard swinging, as if every tap of her heels could summon compliance from the neighborhood itself. She paused to peer through the blinds of the Mercers' home, eyes narrowing with satisfaction, imagining she had orchestrated the perfect intimidation. But Simone Caldwell lingered a few houses away, pretending to water her garden, yet her phone remained discreetly recording Marcia's every gesture. The clipboard queen thought herself untouchable, the officer of rules believing her authority absolute. The tyrant in heels had no idea that her meticulous surveillance had a counter: witness discretion and quiet observation. Inside, I moved methodically between this medical equipment and Lena, who busied herself ensuring the coolers were functioning properly. "They won't stop," she said, voice taut. "She's escalating." "I know," I whispered, scanning the street for the subtle signs of weakness in Marcia Pennington's posture. "Every step she takes is predictable if you watch closely. That predictability is power. It's a flaw she doesn't recognize." The board chair returned to the sidewalk, calling out to another neighbor about a supposed infraction on a shared hedge. Her tone carried the brittle authority of someone who believed fear was enough. The enforcer in crimson gestured toward our property, emphasizing imagined violations, while ignoring the growing evidence of her own miscalculations. From the corner of my eye, Simone adjusted her stance, leaning slightly as if to catch the exact angle of Marcia's SUV, parked too close to the curb. The officer of rules vigilance had a blind spot: her own ego. She was so focused on imagined threats that she couldn't see that the Mercers' allies, even quiet ones, were already moving. Marcia Pennington's voice cut sharply through the morning haze, brittle with irritation. "You know the rules here, Elias. These arrangements are not sanctioned. Every delivery, every device, documented." The clipboard queen tapped her pen aggressively, underlining non-existent violations, while the tyrant in heels surveyed the area, convinced of imminent obedience. I stepped forward, keeping calm, letting the weight of silence punctuate her tirade. "Marcia," I said evenly, "we're following the regulations you approved. Every prescription, every cooling unit, everything is authorized." Her eyes flashed, frustration evident. "Authorized? Don't lecture me about authorization. You think the board can't intervene? I can escalate this. I can call enforcement. I can—" She paused, eyes narrowing as if sensing a shift she couldn't name. Simone's subtle movements didn't go unnoticed by me. The conflicted witness was tipping the balance without confrontation, capturing Marcia Pennington's overreach for later scrutiny. The officer of rules' arrogance blinded her to the simple fact that her actions were being recorded, cataloged, and quietly undermined by those she considered compliant. I glanced at Lena, giving her a small, reassuring nod. The tyranny of heels could not withstand both procedural correctness and meticulous observation. Marcia Pennington might escalate her threats, but every move would now work against her. The enforcer in crimson adjusted her blazer, pacing near the Mercer's front gate. Every step was a performance for the neighborhood, yet it was also a dance over a minefield. I could see the impatience in her stance, the tightening grip on the clipboard. Her predictable pattern made her vulnerable. Her overconfidence was already unraveling her plan. By late afternoon, the tension had built into a palpable storm. The board chair's threats rang hollow in the face of methodical observation and documented compliance. The clipboard queen's pen scratched frantically, yet every mark she made could now be used to expose overreach. The tyrant in heels might not know it, but the scales were tipping ever so subtly toward justice for the Mercers. Even the officer of rules could not predict that her empire of fear was being quietly dismantled, one recorded glance, one measured step at a time. The quiet rebellion of conscience had begun, and the Mercers were ready to leverage it. The next morning, a different rhythm had settled over the street, but Marcia Pennington's presence was impossible to ignore. The board chair arrived early, heels clicking like a metronome across the pavement, her expression a mask of smug confidence. The enforcer in crimson strode toward the Mercer driveway, clipboard held tightly, ready to issue another imagined infraction. Each movement was precise, rehearsed, a performance meant to intimidate, but now I knew how to read it. I lingered near the gate, observing, while Lena checked the medical coolers once more. The clipboard queen jotted notes furiously, unaware that her every pen stroke was being quietly logged on a smartphone by Simone Caldwell. The tyrant in heels gestured toward the new delivery arriving, pointing fingers as if to suggest that the Mercers' legitimate medical supplies were suspicious contraband. Marcia Pennington approached with her usual air of authority, eyes scanning the property for anything that could be misconstrued. The officer of rules, still convinced her position was unassailable, adjusted her blazer, then tapped the SUV parked near the curb, which had been her weapon in the previous standoff. I noticed immediately that she had left the rear window slightly open again, an oversight the Mercers could exploit. I whispered to Lena, "Watch her pattern. Every time she escalates, she leaves a trace." Lena nodded, tension evident in her shoulders. The Mercers had always kept meticulous records, but this new angle, Marcia Pennington's arrogance and predictable routines, was a discovery that could tip the scales without confrontation. As the enforcer in crimson began pacing again, she muttered about unauthorized deliveries and supposed irregularities. I could see the strain in her posture. The board chair's confidence was unshakable only in appearance. Her foot tapped nervously against the pavement. The tyrant in heels' gaze flicked to the neighbor across the street, but she didn't notice the conflicted witness watching her, phone in hand, waiting for the right moment. Suddenly, the pattern became clear. Marcia Pennington had been so focused on fabricating violations that she hadn't realized her own actions created liability. Every hurried maneuver, every misstep, was now evidence if observed correctly. The clipboard queen had unknowingly provided me with a roadmap to expose her overreach. Every threat she issued, every emphatic gesture, revealed her priorities and her vulnerabilities. I whispered, "This is it. Every escalation she makes, every attempt to intimidate, it can be turned back on her." Lena's grip on the medical cooler tightened. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked. I nodded. "It's not just enough, it's perfect. Predictable arrogance is more revealing than any confession." From the corner, Simone, the conflicted witness, recorded Marcia Pennington's movements while keeping a low profile. The enforcer in crimson pointed to a delivery, declaring it suspicious. The officer of rules followed suit, mimicking the gestures of authority, unaware that each moment was being captured. Then came the crucial observation. Marcia Pennington's SUV, parked hastily near the Mercers' property, had an open window. Her bag of pills, left momentarily within reach, exposed her to a risk she couldn't have anticipated. I motioned subtly to Lena. "The leverage is in front of us. Every detail, every step she's taken today is the key." The board chair stomped, commanding attention, yet now her very presence felt precarious. The tyrant in heels wasn't invincible. The officer of rules had left the door open, literally and figuratively, for exposure. Our preparation had begun, without confrontation, and yet it promised results. Marcia Pennington's overconfidence had become the Mercers' discovery, and the neighborhood watched silently. Tension and anticipation thick in the air. Every glance, every documented misstep was now a weapon waiting to be deployed. The stage was set, and the balance of power was quietly shifting toward those she had sought to intimidate. The afternoon sun glared down on the Mercer property, casting long shadows that stretched like silent witnesses to the tension mounting on the street. Marcia Pennington, the board chair in her signature crimson blazer, arrived with calculated purpose, clipboard in hand. The enforcer in crimson's heels clicked sharply against the pavement, each step a reminder that intimidation had been her currency for too long. From my vantage point behind the hedge, I watched her movements closely. Every gesture, every hasty glance, carried the weight of expectation and ego. The clipboard queen scribbled furiously, noting what she thought were irregularities. But in truth, each mark mapped out her own vulnerability. The tyrant in heels gestured wildly toward the Mercer's delivery van, as if the mere presence of legitimate medical equipment was proof of criminality. Her performance was theatrical, yet predictably flawed. Simone Caldwell, the conflicted witness, lingered nearby, phone poised. Her eyes flicked between Marcia Pennington and the Mercers, weighing loyalty against conscience. She had begun to see the cracks in the officer of rules facade, the tiny slips, the hurried motions, the arrogance that made her predictable. I whispered to Lena, "Every movement she makes is evidence in motion. Watch carefully." The board chair raised her voice, summoning the neighbors as if to publicly assert dominance. Her commands were sharp, yet beneath them there was tension, a subtle tremor in the way she adjusted her blazer. The enforcer in crimson followed suit, nodding eagerly, unaware that each directive she issued could now be turned against her. Then it happened. Marcia Pennington's SUV, left haphazardly parked with the rear window slightly ajar, caught my attention. The officer of rules had inadvertently left her personal items visible: pills, prescription bottles, and a small stash of controlled substances. It was an oversight so glaring that even the clipboard queen, if she noticed, could only gape silently. I signaled Lena subtly. "This is our opening. The evidence isn't just documentation, it's in plain sight." Marcia Pennington, oblivious to the risk, stomped toward the delivery van, calling out accusations that echoed down the quiet street. The tyrant in heels brandished her clipboard like a weapon, asserting authority she no longer fully commanded. Each accusation was a misstep, a piece of a puzzle that we had been carefully assembling. I watched the conflicted witness inch closer, hesitation in her movements. Simone's eyes betrayed the internal struggle, wanting to support the board chair, yet realizing that truth and justice demanded another course. The Mercer's patience, paired with careful observation, had transformed her passive presence into a potential catalyst for exposure. I whispered, "She's overplaying her hand. Every accusation, every display of power is now fragile. The more dramatic she becomes, the more the evidence multiplies." Lena nodded, holding the cooler tightly, as if it were both shield and symbol of our stakes. The board chair pivoted toward the neighbor's house across the street, pointing fingers and gesturing, oblivious that her own vehicle sat vulnerable. The enforcer in crimson, sensing control slipping, waved her hands with exaggerated urgency. The clipboard queen's notes had become a roadmap, revealing each procedural error, each unsanctioned move. I took a deep breath. This was the turning point. Marcia Pennington's arrogance, her obsession with proving the Mercers guilty, had blinded her to the simple truth. Her actions were self-incriminating. The officer of rules was about to be exposed, not through confrontation, but through her own carelessness. Every neighbor watching, every step taken, every item left visible on the SUV brought us closer to the revelation that would undo her entire campaign. The board chair's reign of intimidation teetered, and the stage was set for accountability to arrive quietly, decisively, and utterly ironic. The evening sun dipped low, painting long orange streaks across the Mercer driveway, but the tension felt heavier than the heat. Marcia Pennington, the board chair, stood by her SUV, flipping through her clipboard with an almost frantic energy. The enforcer in crimson tapped her heels impatiently, casting anxious glances toward the neighbors who had started to gather, murmuring quietly. The clipboard queen scribbled notes feverishly, but each mark betrayed uncertainty. Even the tyrant in heels, usually so commanding, seemed on edge, her gestures sharper, quicker, yet oddly hesitant. From my concealed position, I noticed Simone Caldwell step forward. Her conflicted eyes darted between Marcia Pennington and the Mercer's house. For weeks, she had played both sides, loyal to the officer of rules while secretly questioning the legitimacy of the accusations. Now, she was finally making her choice. The weight of what she carried, knowledge of Marcia's own unsanctioned stash and improvised cover-ups, made her tremble visibly. I whispered to Lena, "She's about to tip the scales. Watch carefully." Simone cleared her throat, lifting her phone to show a string of messages. Her hands shook slightly, but the courage behind the act was undeniable. The board chair, oblivious, continued pacing, her red blazer catching the dying sunlight like a warning flare. The enforcer in crimson waved her hands toward the Mercer's cooler, gesturing accusations that felt more desperate than authoritative. This isn't right," Simone said, her voice firm despite the quiver. "I've seen what Marcia left in her car. The prescriptions, the stash. She's been orchestrating this against the Mercers for weeks." The officer of rules froze mid-step, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as if she had never considered the possibility of being confronted by her own ally. Marcia Pennington spun around, eyes narrowing, the clipboard queen now silent, watching her superior falter. "What are you saying?" the tyrant in heels demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Are you accusing me?" Simone nodded, holding the phone slightly higher. "Yes, all this, your evidence against the Mercers, fabricated. Your so-called violations, manipulated to provoke a response. And your vehicle, the K-9 unit will see what's inside if someone looks closely. You've created your own downfall." The board chair's face drained of color. Every accusation, every step she had taken, every boast of authority now seemed meaningless. The enforcer in crimson shifted nervously, realizing the power dynamic had changed in a heartbeat. The clipboard queen's pen hovered over the page, now unused, a silent witness to the unraveling of the regime she had once supported. I stepped closer, voice calm but deliberate. "Simone's right. Every move she's made, every call to the police, it's all backfiring. And the dog, Max, won't miss what's in that SUV. The evidence isn't just in documents, it's in plain sight." Lena gripped my arm, steadying herself, the weight of anticipation filling the air. Marcia Pennington tried to regain control, gesturing wildly, her voice rising with desperation. "You can't just. This is my authority. I enforce rules." The tyrant in heels, once so confident, now sounded small, pleading. The officer of rules had become the accused, and the spotlight of scrutiny had shifted entirely. Simone stepped fully into the light, unwavering. "The Mercers are innocent. You've manipulated every fact to create a crime where none exists. The authorities will know the truth, and the K-9 unit will verify it instantly." The tension snapped like a taut wire. Marcia Pennington's hands trembled over the clipboard, the enforcer in crimson looked away, and the clipboard queen's eyes met mine, silent admission written clearly across her face. The tyrant in heels had lost her stage, and the scales of justice were tipping, carried by the courage of the conflicted witness who finally acted. In that moment, the first step of the Mercer's vindication was set in motion, not through confrontation, but through the revelation brought forth by the witness who chose truth over fear. Every heartbeat on the street echoed the irony. The board chair's own hubris had summoned her undoing. The tension had shifted palpably on the Mercer street. The board chair, Marcia Pennington, now fully aware that the conflicted witness had exposed cracks in her plan, struggled to maintain control. The enforcer in crimson tapped impatiently against her SUV, eyes darting toward the approaching patrol car and the distant flashing lights. The clipboard queen, normally meticulous, now held her notes loosely, her hand shaking as if she feared the repercussions of Marcia's unraveling authority. The tyrant in heels, once radiating intimidation, looked smaller in the growing shadows of doubt. Even the officer of rules seemed weighed down by the knowledge that the scales had begun to tip. From across the street, Elias Mercer motioned to Lena, his gaze steady yet alert. They had been waiting for the opportunity to reclaim control of the situation, and Simone Caldwell's revelation had provided the opening. The conflicted witness had shifted the power subtly, yet unmistakably in the Mercers' favor. Every glance, every step now mattered. A single miscalculation could still spiral into disaster. Marcia Pennington stepped forward, attempting to reassert her dominance, her red blazer striking against the waning light. "This changes nothing," she said sharply, her voice betraying the slightest tremor. "You think a few messages will erase the authority I wield? The rules are still mine to enforce." The officer of rules frowned, realizing that her own complicity had been exposed indirectly by the Mercers and Simone's awareness. Simone took a deliberate step closer, holding the phone higher for all to see. "Authority isn't real without truth behind it," she said firmly. The enforcer in crimson looked away. The clipboard queen swallowed nervously, and the tyrant in heels' sharp gestures faltered. Even the neighbors peeking from their windows began to murmur, sensing the shift in power. Elias Mercer moved subtly, positioning himself so that Max, the K-9 unit, would have an unobstructed path to the area near Marcia Pennington's SUV. Lena whispered instructions, coordinating with Officer Talbot over the radio. The Mercers' calm, precise movements contrasted sharply with the board chair's frenzied energy. The enforcer in crimson's tapping and the clipboard queen's hesitant glances. The air thickened as Max approached the SUV. The enforcer in crimson stiffened, glancing nervously at Marcia, who clutched the clipboard like a shield. "You're bluffing," Marcia Pennington hissed under her breath, her voice losing volume in the tension of the moment. "This won't hold up. None of this will—" But the dog moved with purpose, nose to the vent. Sniffing the area around the passenger window Marcia had left slightly ajar. The officer of rules stepped back, realizing the implications, while the tyrant in heels now covered her mouth, her eyes wide. The clipboard queen's fingers twitched over her notes, but she said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. Max's trained alert rang out clearly, a sharp signal that narcotics were detected. Marcia Pennington froze mid-step, her face pale. The board chair's own hubris had orchestrated her exposure, the enforcer in crimson's support now meaningless, and the tyrant in heels' attempts at authority crumbling. The neighbors shifted in their driveways, whispers filling the air, as the irony of the situation settled in. Marcia Pennington, who had tried to manipulate the law and the community, had inadvertently given the proof that confirmed her own wrongdoing. Simone Caldwell exhaled slowly, her role complete, having risked everything to reveal the truth. Elias Mercer and Lena watched carefully as Max's alert turned the attention of Officer Talbot fully onto Marcia Pennington's SUV. The Mercer's counterplan was in motion. The officer of rules' confidence eroded further, while the tyrant in heels' gestures grew desperate and uncontrolled. Every heartbeat felt amplified in the street, each second a delicate step toward exposing the board chair's deceit. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The Mercers now had the leverage they needed, with Max's K-9 alert as the pivotal turning point. The clipboard queen's silence, the enforcer in crimson's hesitation, and the tyrant in heels' faltering commands painted a picture of a regime crumbling from within. In that charged moment, the street held its breath, the Mercers poised to execute the next phase of their plan, legal and psychological strategy, supported by a dog trained to uncover hidden truths. Marcia Pennington, the board chair, had underestimated the consequences of her own arrogance. The street had transformed into a stage of quiet chaos. The board chair, Marcia Pennington, now visibly rattled, shuffled between the SUV and the cluster of neighbors who had gathered cautiously, whispering among themselves. The enforcer in crimson hovered beside her, trying to project authority, but her movements were jittery, betraying the unease that had settled over the group. The clipboard queen, her notes now forgotten in her lap, scanned the crowd with wide eyes, realizing the power had slipped from her hands. The tyrant in heels adjusted her stance repeatedly, a futile attempt to appear in control, while the officer of rules silently assessed the situation, the weight of accountability pressing down. Elias Mercer stayed close to Lena, eyes sharp, scanning for every opportunity the unfolding scene might present. The K-9 alert had delivered the crucial evidence, but the Mercers needed to convert it into unshakable leverage. Simone Caldwell had stepped back slightly, her presence unnoticed by most, yet essential. The conflicted witness had given them insight that no one else could have predicted. Every heartbeat, every glance, now mattered more than ever. Marcia Pennington took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "This changes nothing," she said, her voice firm, but edged with uncertainty. The enforcer in crimson coughed lightly, trying to hide her nervousness. "Rules are rules, and authority can't be questioned," Marcia continued, pointing at the Mercer's home as though mere gestures could reclaim control. But the clipboard queen's gaze faltered. She had seen the dog's alert, understood its meaning. The tyrant in heels' hands twitched, betraying the facade of confidence. Across the street, Elias stepped forward, his movements deliberate. Authority isn't given, Marcia, he said, voice calm but commanding. It's earned through truth and responsibility. You've lost both. The neighbors murmured quietly, their whispers carrying weight, each echo a reminder that Marcia Pennington's intimidation tactics no longer worked. The officer of rule's posture stiffened, recognizing that the balance of control had irrevocably shifted. Marcia Pennington's eyes flicked to the SUV, her grip on the clipboard tightening. The enforcer in crimson whispered urgently, "We need a plan now." The clipboard queen shook her head, realizing too late that there was no recovery from the evidence Max had provided. The tyrant in heel's attempts at authority felt increasingly hollow, the crowd's shifting focus dissolving the power she had once wielded effortlessly. Elias and Lena exchanged a brief glance, a silent agreement passing between them. Max, still alert, sniffed around the SUV again, confirming the narcotics presence, and Officer Talbot began preparing to document everything for legal procedures. The board chair's pride and arrogance had led directly to her exposure. Every gesture, every attempt to regain control only highlighted her vulnerability. Marcia Pennington's voice rose, almost a shout. "You'll regret this. You think you've won." But the enforcer in crimson's hesitation, the clipboard queen's fearful glances, and the tyrant in heel's unstable posture undermined the threat. Elias Mercer stepped slightly closer, ensuring the neighbors could see the unfolding truth. "Winning isn't about fear, Marcia," he said. "It's about accountability." The tension on the street was electric. Each second stretched, weighted with anticipation, as the Mercers methodically prepared to secure legal intervention. The board chair's bluster collided with the reality of exposure, leaving the enforcer in crimson frozen, the clipboard queen silent, and the tyrant in heels almost paralyzed. Even the officer of rules now acknowledged the shift. The HOA's authority had been decisively challenged. Marcia Pennington's eyes darted across the street, taking in the neighbors, the K-9 alert, and the officers preparing their next steps. She realized, perhaps too late, that every act of intimidation, every falsified accusation, had only strengthened the case against her. The balance of power had irreversibly moved into the hands of the Mercers. In that charged moment, the street became a chessboard, and Marcia Pennington, once so sure of her control, was now just a single piece facing inevitable checkmate. The Mercers, calm and precise, were ready to finish what Max had started, exposing the truth and restoring justice to the neighborhood. The morning sunlight cut through the neighborhood like a blade, glinting off the Mercers' windows and casting long shadows across the street. The board chair, Marcia Pennington, was pacing in front of her SUV, her crimson blazer now a symbol not of power, but of looming accountability. The enforcer in crimson hovered near her side, trying to suppress visible anxiety, while the clipboard queen clutched her notes, muttering to herself in a frantic attempt to maintain composure. The tyrant in heels tapped her heel against the pavement, the sound echoing hollowly, while the officer of rules simply observed, calculating and restrained, knowing the scales had already tipped. Elias Mercer stepped from his driveway, Lena at his side, eyes sharp, voice calm but unyielding. They had prepared meticulously, leveraging the K-9 alert as the fulcrum to shift momentum entirely in their favor. The neighborhood watched with bated breath, sensing that the usual order of intimidation and fear was cracking. Every footstep, every glance from the Mercers radiated confidence that Marcia Pennington's threats could no longer suppress. Marcia's eyes narrowed, darting to the crowd of neighbors who had begun gathering along the sidewalks. "This isn't over," she spat, pointing at Elias. The enforcer in crimson flinched slightly, realizing that the facade of control was slipping. The clipboard queen adjusted her notes again, though none of the scribbles could conceal the growing tension. The tyrant in heels exhaled sharply, frustration mingled with the awareness that every observer was now evaluating her credibility, not her authority. Elias took a deliberate step forward. "Marcia, every lie, every fabricated claim, every attempt to intimidate, your actions have consequences," he said. His tone was calm, almost conversational, yet layered with unshakable authority. The officer of rules shifted slightly, acknowledging that the HOA's ability to enforce arbitrary punishments had been undermined decisively. Marcia Pennington's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself, the weight of exposure pressing down. The Mercer's strategy unfolded methodically. Every neighbor witness, every corroborated account of Marcia's false reporting had been documented. Every step she had taken to frame them was now evidence stacked against her. The enforcer in crimson whispered nervously to the clipboard queen, but their words barely reached over the growing murmur of the crowd. The tyrant in heels attempted to project dominance, raising her voice, but the effect was feeble against the momentum Elias had built. Max, the K-9, remained close to Officer Talbot, nostrils twitching as he scanned the immediate area, reinforcing the validity of the alert that had exposed Marcia's deceit. The board chair's glare flickered between the dog and the Mercers, her attempts at intimidation ineffective. The enforcer in crimson fidgeted, realizing that Marcia Pennington's miscalculation had left them all vulnerable. The clipboard queen's notes, once a symbol of her meticulous control, now lay forgotten in the chaos. Elias gestured subtly to Lena, who held a folder containing the official report, legal statements, and neighbor testimonies. The neighborhood crowd leaned closer, sensing the culmination of events. "This ends now," Elias said, voice steady, resonating across the street. The law, the facts, and the truth are on our side. The officer of rules nodded imperceptibly, acknowledging the shift. The power dynamic was final. Marcia Pennington's face twisted in anger, a mixture of disbelief and rage. The enforcer in crimson looked ready to bolt. The clipboard queen slumped slightly, and the tyrant in heels' attempt at a sharp retort faded mid-thought. Elias and Lena, composed and unwavering, had cornered their adversary without confrontation, through strategy, evidence, and precise execution. The Mercers had taken the K-9 alert and orchestrated every neighbor, every observer, and every law-abiding detail to place Marcia Pennington into an irreversible position of accountability. She could no longer manipulate, threaten, or deceive. The board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, and the officer of rules had all been outmaneuvered. The street, once a theater of intimidation, now resonated with the quiet power of justice. In the moments that followed, Marcia Pennington's attempts at self-preservation collided with the inevitability of exposure. Each alias she had worn, the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, the officer of rules, was stripped away, revealing a woman undone by her own schemes. Elias Mercer remained calm, a silent promise of resolution emanating from every measured movement. The community hall smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. Chairs were arranged in tight rows, all facing the raised dais where Marcia Pennington had insisted the monthly HOA meeting proceed. Today, however, the air vibrated with unease. The board chair, poised in her crimson blazer, scanned the room, attempting to radiate authority, but the enforcer in crimson shuffled nervously beside her. Even the clipboard queen's meticulous notes did little to mask her apprehension, while the tyrant in heels tapped her polished shoes against the floor, a brittle rhythm of defiance. The officer of rules stood stoically, though a faint tremor in her hands betrayed awareness that the usual power had shifted. Elias Mercer entered with Lena, carrying an aura of calculated calm. Their presence immediately drew murmurs from neighbors, who had followed every development after Marcia Pennington's K-9 fiasco. Elias's gaze swept across the room, noting which residents would serve as silent allies, and which still clung to loyalty out of fear. The air was thick with anticipation. The showdown everyone had been waiting for had arrived. Marcia Pennington raised a hand, trying to regain control. "Let's maintain order," she commanded. Her voice, sharp yet uneven, echoed off the hall walls. The enforcer in crimson glanced at her, doubt flickering in her eyes. The clipboard queen adjusted her papers frantically, muttering numbers that now carried no authority. The tyrant in heels exhaled, realizing that the room no longer reflected fear, but scrutiny. Even the officer of rules seemed to hesitate, aware that the narrative had already been rewritten outside these walls. Elias stepped forward, voice carrying effortlessly. "Marcia," he began, "every false report you filed, every attempt to manipulate the law, and every intimidation tactic, this community has witnessed it all." The crowd leaned in, whispers spread. The K-9 alert didn't just expose your deception, it exposed your negligence, your illegal possession, and your attempts to endanger others. The board chair's expression tightened, a flicker of panic betraying her composure. The enforcer in crimson shifted uneasily, casting furtive glances toward exits. The clipboard queen's hands trembled as she adjusted her documents, while the tyrant in heels' confident tap-tap rhythm faltered. The officer of rules' lips pressed into a thin line. No one doubted that the authority she represented had been effectively neutralized. Marcia Pennington opened her mouth, perhaps to launch a counterattack, but the K-9 alert report and Officer Talbot's corroboration had been circulated in advance to all residents. The evidence was irrefutable, and the Mercers had orchestrated every detail with precision. Elias didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every calm word, every measured step conveyed power far beyond Marcia's reach. The enforcer in crimson sighed audibly, realizing that their domino effect of intimidation had finally been halted. Lena Mercer handed a folder to the hall monitor, ensuring that each resident could see copies of the police report and the official K-9 findings. The crowd absorbed the details, murmurs shifting into a collective recognition of truth. The board chair's hands clenched into fists. The enforcer in crimson sank slightly in her chair. The clipboard queen's eyes darted desperately, and the tyrant in heels' jaw tightened as reality eclipsed fantasy. The officer of rules' attempt at neutrality was now impotent. The hall had become a tribunal of accountability. Elias approached the podium, gaze fixed on Marcia Pennington. "You aim to harm us with lies. Yet, through strategy, evidence, and unwavering truth, your actions have been undone," he said. The board chair's crimson blazer, once a symbol of fear, now seemed almost theatrical, a costume stripped of its menace. The enforcer in crimson's shoulders slumped, the clipboard queen's meticulous order dissolved, and the tyrant in heels' posture lost its final edge. Neighbors whispered, some clapping quietly, others nodding in affirmation. The officer of rules shifted, acknowledging that the Mercers' methodical approach had rendered the HOA's tactics powerless. The community had witnessed the collapse of Marcia Pennington's authority, her aliases, the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, the officer of rules, now hollow labels. By the end, the Mercers' quiet dominance was absolute. The K-9 alert had been the pivot, the evidence had been the sword, and as Marcia Pennington sat, Cornered by her own missteps and the undeniable truth, the room understood that justice had been delivered without a single raised fist. Dawn broke over the Mercer residence, casting a warm glow across the quiet cul-de-sac. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for weeks finally lifted, replaced by a tentative calm. From the porch, I watched as neighbors cautiously emerged, whispers of relief and admiration weaving through the morning air. Marcia Pennington had been taken into custody, her reign of fear, whether as the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, or the officer of rules, effectively over. The community could finally breathe. Inside, Lena cradled the baby, the tiny life that had been at the center of Marcia's malicious vendetta. Every cry, every coup reminded us why this battle had mattered so much. The officer of rules had once seemed unstoppable, her presence a constant reminder that even in supposedly lawful spaces, cruelty could masquerade as authority. Now, watching the baby stretch and yawn, the absurdity of her arrogance became painfully clear. The clipboard queen's meticulously timed threats, the tyrant in heels' poised intimidation, even the enforcer in crimson's rigid authority, all had crumbled under evidence, strategy, and patience. I stepped onto the driveway, greeting neighbors who nodded with smiles that carried gratitude and newfound courage. The board chair's aura of supremacy had vanished, replaced by the community's recognition that fear had no permanent home here. Conversations bubbled around me, recounting the irony of the K-9 alert, the swift intervention, and the undeniable truth of Marcia's miscalculations. Every recounting emphasized that sometimes the smallest details, an open window, a misjudged vehicle placement, could shift the balance of power entirely. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the Mercers' front yard became a quiet sanctuary. Friends and supportive neighbors trickled in, offering congratulations and sharing relief. The clipboard queen's schematics, once a tool of intimidation, were now laughably irrelevant. The tyrant in heels' meticulous schedules and procedural posturing had become anecdotal, tales of overconfidence that reminded everyone how fragile enforced authority can be when confronted with diligence and truth. Even the enforcer in crimson, who had once seemed an unyielding wall, now appeared human, fallible, trapped by her own schemes. I leaned against the porch railing, reflecting on the entire ordeal. Marcia Pennington's vendetta had been personal, targeted, and dangerously close to causing irreversible harm. Yet, the K-9 alert, the unassuming dog Max pulling the leash on the accuser's own vehicle, had turned her own strategy against her. The officer of rules could do nothing, as the evidence laid bare the absurdity and criminality of her actions. The neighborhood had witnessed firsthand that manipulation, when unchecked, could lead to spectacular self-sabotage. The community's resilience, the strategic patience of the Mercers, and the meticulous observation of every detail ensured that justice was not only served but seen. The board chair's influence was gone, replaced by citizens empowered to challenge falsehoods and intimidation. The enforcer in crimson's rigid control dissolved in the face of truth. The clipboard queen's obsessive notes, the tyrant in heels' carefully curated threats, and the officer of rules' supposed authority all became relics of a failed attempt to impose fear. Finally, as evening descended, I turned toward the neighbors still lingering, their eyes reflecting a mix of relief and admiration. "If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny," I said, voice steady but warm. The words carried a weight, a promise that courage, strategy, and vigilance could overturn even the most audacious abuse of power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Mercers' home glowed with a quiet triumph. Marcia Pennington, whether as the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, or the officer of rules, was gone. But her story would remain a cautionary tale. The community had learned that fear could be confronted, deception could be exposed, and justice could arrive from the most unexpected angles. Hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood exhaled collectively. The streets were safe, the air clear, and the Mercers' legacy of resilience firmly established. Life could finally return to normal, but now, with eyes wide open, aware of the fine line between authority and tyranny, and confident that the next time injustice appeared, it would meet the same unwavering vigilance. Drew murmurs from neighbors, who had followed every development after Marcia Pennington's K-9 fiasco. Elias's gaze swept across the room, noting which residents would serve as silent allies, and which still clung to loyalty out of fear. The air was thick with anticipation. The showdown everyone had been waiting for had arrived. Marcia Pennington raised a hand, trying to regain control. "Let's maintain order," she commanded. Her voice, sharp yet uneven, echoed off the hall walls. The enforcer in crimson glanced at her, doubt flickering in her eyes. The clipboard queen adjusted her papers frantically, muttering numbers that now carried no authority. The tyrant in heels exhaled, realizing that the room no longer reflected fear, but scrutiny. Even the officer of rules seemed to hesitate, aware that the narrative had already been rewritten outside these walls. Elias stepped forward, voice carrying effortlessly. "Marcia," he began, "every false report you filed, every attempt to manipulate the law, and every intimidation tactic, this community has witnessed it all." The crowd leaned in. Whispers spread. "The K-9 alert didn't just expose your deception. It exposed your negligence, your illegal possession, and your attempts to endanger others. The board chair's expression tightened, a flicker of panic betraying her composure. The enforcer in crimson shifted uneasily, casting furtive glances toward exits. The clipboard queen's hands trembled as she adjusted her documents, while the tyrant in heel's confident tap-tap rhythm faltered. The officer of rule's lips pressed into a thin line. No one doubted that the authority she represented had been effectively neutralized. Marcia Pennington opened her mouth, perhaps to launch a counterattack, but the K-9 alert report and Officer Talbot's corroboration had been circulated in advance to all residents. The evidence was irrefutable, and the Mercers had orchestrated every detail with precision. Elias didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every calm word, every measured step conveyed power far beyond Marcia's reach. The enforcer in crimson sighed audibly, realizing that their domino effect of intimidation had finally been halted. Lena Mercer handed a folder to the hall monitor, ensuring that each resident could see copies of the police report and the official K-9 findings. The crowd absorbed the details, murmurs shifting into a collective recognition of truth. The board chair's hands clenched into fists. The enforcer in crimson sank slightly in her chair. The clipboard queen's eyes darted desperately, and the tyrant in heel's jaw tightened as reality eclipsed fantasy. The officer of rule's attempt at neutrality was now impotent. The hall had become a tribunal of accountability. Elias approached the podium, gaze fixed on Marcia Pennington. "You aim to harm us with lies. Yet, through strategy, evidence, and unwavering truth, your actions have been undone," he said. The board chair's crimson blazer, once a symbol of fear, now seemed almost theatrical, a costume stripped of its menace. The enforcer in crimson's shoulders slumped, the clipboard queen's meticulous order dissolved, and the tyrant in heel's posture lost its final edge. Neighbors whispered, some clapping quietly, others nodding in affirmation. The officer of rules shifted, acknowledging that the Mercers' methodical approach had rendered the HOA's tactics powerless. The community had witnessed the collapse of Marcia Pennington's authority, her aliases, the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, the officer of rules, now hollow labels. By the end, the Mercers' quiet dominance was absolute. The K-9 alert had been the pivot, the evidence had been the sword. And as Marcia Pennington sat, cornered by her own missteps and the undeniable truth, the room understood that justice had been delivered without a single raised fist. Dawn broke over the Mercer residence, casting a warm glow across the quiet cul-de-sac. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for weeks finally lifted, replaced by a tentative calm. From the porch, I watched as neighbors cautiously emerged, whispers of relief and admiration weaving through the morning air. Marcia Pennington had been taken into custody, her reign of fear, whether as the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, or the officer of rules, effectively over. The community could finally breathe. Inside, Lena cradled the baby, the tiny life that had been at the center of Marcia's malicious vendetta. Every cry, every coup reminded us why this battle had mattered so much. The officer of rules had once seemed unstoppable, her presence a constant reminder that even in supposedly lawful spaces, cruelty could masquerade as authority. Now, watching the baby stretch and yawn, the absurdity of her arrogance became painfully clear. The clipboard queen's meticulously timed threats, the tyrant in heels' poised intimidation, even the enforcer in crimson's rigid authority, all had crumbled under evidence, strategy, and patience. I stepped onto the driveway, greeting neighbors who nodded with smiles that carried gratitude and newfound courage. The board chair's aura of supremacy had vanished, replaced by the community's recognition that fear had no permanent home here. Conversations bubbled around me, recounting the irony of the K-9 alert, the swift intervention, and the undeniable truth of Marcia's miscalculations. Every recounting emphasized that sometimes the smallest details, an open window, a misjudged vehicle placement, could shift the balance of power entirely. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the Mercers' front yard became a quiet sanctuary. Friends and supportive neighbors trickled in, offering congratulations and sharing relief. The clipboard queen's schematics, once a tool of intimidation, were now laughably irrelevant. The tyrant in heels' meticulous schedules and procedural posturing had become anecdotal, tales of overconfidence that reminded everyone how fragile enforced authority can be when confronted with diligence and truth. Even the enforcer in crimson, who had once seemed an unyielding wall, now appeared human, fallible, trapped by her own schemes. I leaned against the porch railing, reflecting on the entire ordeal. Marcia Pennington's vendetta had been personal, targeted, and dangerously close to causing irreversible harm. Yet, the K-9 alert, the unassuming dog Max pulling the leash on the accuser's own vehicle, had turned her own strategy against her. The officer of rules could do nothing, as the evidence laid bare the absurdity and criminality of her actions. The neighborhood had witnessed firsthand that manipulation, when unchecked, could lead to spectacular self-sabotage. The community's resilience, the strategic patience of the Mercers, and the meticulous observation of every detail ensured that justice was not only served but seen. The board chair's influence was gone, replaced by citizens empowered to challenge falsehoods and intimidation. The enforcer in Crimson's rigid control dissolved in the face of truth. The clipboard queen's obsessive notes, the tyrant in heels' carefully curated threats, and the officer of rules' supposed authority all became relics of a failed attempt to impose fear. Finally, as evening descended, I turned toward the neighbors still lingering, their eyes reflecting a mix of relief and admiration. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, I said, voice steady but warm. The words carried a weight, a promise that courage, strategy, and vigilance could overturn even the most audacious abuse of power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Mercers' home glowed with a quiet triumph. Marcia Pennington, whether as the board chair, the enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, or the officer of rules, was gone. But her story would remain a cautionary tale. The community had learned that fear could be confronted, deception could be exposed, and justice could arrive from the most unexpected angles. Hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood exhaled collectively. The streets were safe, the air clear, and the Mercers' legacy of resilience firmly established. Life could finally return to normal, but now, with eyes wide open, aware of the fine line between authority and tyranny, and confident that the next time injustice appeared, it would meet the same unwavering vigilance.